Hey, I'm Chris from Make Everything, and today I'm going to show you how I made this really simple upholstered corner bench with some hidden storage, simple tools, and no sewing machine. Check it out. All right, so to make this bench, I'm going to be using 2x2 pine from Home Depot. Now, this measures 1.5 by 1.5 inches, and it's pretty inexpensive. It used to be a lot cheaper, and I like to make things that need to be light but also pretty strong out of this material. Now, I'm using wood glue and decking screws at all my joints, and that's going to make this thing nice and strong. And what I'm doing here is I'm essentially building an upper frame and a lower frame, and then I'm going to be putting vertical bars to act as the support structure for this bench seat. Now, this is an L-shaped bench, and the top of it is going to be the exact profile of what I need. But in my case specifically, the bottom of it is going to need to have an open corner because this is going in my camper and I need to build it around a heater. So what I did was I built the top frame first, and then I laid the boards on top of it for the lower frame, and sort of had to think about what I was going to do here because I need to build around the heater. And since I'm not at the camper, I have to do this whole project based off of measurements that I did last time I was up there. So I'm using, like I said, glue and some 2.5-inch decking screws to screw this whole thing together. Now, the big thing here is I want to make sure that my corners are nice and supported, and I'm also going to be putting some sheathing on the front, so I want to make sure that I leave myself some room so that I can tack in the board that's going to go on the face of this. Now, this is going in the corner, so I won't have to put wood on the back, but I want to make sure that it's all covered where I have to paint it. Now, once I have those frames done, I can cut the vertical pieces. I set a stop block on my miter saw, and then I cut those. Overall, the wood section of this bench is going to be about 15 inches high. So I made those 12-inch risers, and then with the two pieces of 1.5 inches for the 2x2, I'll be at about that height. And I can screw these in from the top as I go around the perimeter, and I add myself a little leg in the back just to keep myself supported while I glue and screw everything in from the top. Now, this thing is going to be under constant pressure going down, and you can see the way that I designed it. It's two frames that sit down on top of those boards, and then anywhere that there was a corner, I actually offset the vertical post by a little bit so it would hit more than one piece of the frame. You know, I didn't want one of those pieces to be able to pop off, but once I add the 1/2-inch plywood bench top, this thing is going to be really strong. So now with that done, I wanted to add another little support brace in the back just to temporarily get me through the rest of this building process. When I get up to the camper, I'm going to be taking that out. Before I start moving forward with the support pieces, I add a couple of more kind of screwing pieces that I can nail into. And then I add these little partial blocks inside the frame. Now, one of the things that I need inside this bench is the ability to get underneath it and the ability to have some storage. Since this is going in a camper, storage is important. And if you were building this for your house, you'd also maybe want to add some storage underneath it, right? There's no reason to make this void just totally inaccessible if you can make it a place that you can store little things safely. So I'm adding some blocking and some bracing around the perimeter of this that I can then add some strips of wood that will be attached to the bottom of the actual seat cushion, and that'll allow you to take the seat cushion in and out really easily. It'll make a little bit more sense once we get a little further in. Now I'm going to be using 1/2-inch plywood to go underneath the foam, and in order to cut that up, I put it on this piece of pink foam, and then I'm going to be using a track saw to cut it. Now, I know a lot of people are going to think that they don't have a track saw, so they're not going to be able to do this project, but you really don't need to cut super precisely if you're going to upholster in this way. I just happen to have a track saw, and I really enjoy using it. And honestly, nowadays, track saws have gotten to be pretty inexpensive, so if you're interested in woodworking, I would highly recommend making the investment in one because I use it as much or more than my actual table saw. Basically, it's a circular saw that rides on an aluminum track that's perfectly straight, and it makes cutting up sheet goods so much easier, especially if you're in a small shop or if you do any work on site. There's a couple brands that make them battery powered. I have the Makita, but I know Ryobi makes one, DeWalt makes one, Milwaukee's got one coming out. You can get it with a cord, without. You need a track saw. I'm telling you, it'll change your life. So anyway, I'm cutting this up, and I'm just tracing around it, making sure that the piece of wood fits. And then I've got this wainscot MDF, fiberboard wainscoting that I'm actually going to be using backwards so I get a smooth face on it. And again, I'm using the track saw here just to kind of rip it in place because my table saw is just not really usable when all this stuff is sitting on top of it. So I cut that up and cut it at the proper height. I did leave a little bit of a gap so I could caulk it in. And then I'm going to be cutting down the MDF so that I can start stapling it to the front. Now, the other side of this is a white primed beadboard style piece of material, but I have had luck using the back side of this before. As long as you give it a couple coats of paint, it'll paint up really well. And the only issue I have is on one corner, there's going to be a little kind of weird section where the wainscoting pokes through, but once everything is caulked, you'll never see it, and painted, it's going to look great. So I'm using an 18 gauge narrow crown brad stapler to hold that on. You don't really want to use brad nails when you're using a thin material like this because the heads will sink right through it. But if you can use a stapler, you'll get a better grab, and obviously use some glue. Now you can see those little strips that I'm putting across. And when I add those in, I put some glue on them, and then I drop the 1/2 inch piece of plywood on top of that. And then that's going to add just a little bit more support to the actual bench seat itself when you're sitting on it. Now, I don't want to attach the plywood to the frame that I built because I want the whole thing to be removable so I can get into it for storage and maintenance of the heater it's going on top of. So this is going to just kind of add some structural rigidity, and with those brad nails and the glue, this thing's going to actually avoid sagging really, really well. Now that that is done, I can start to make the actual seat pad. Now, there's a couple ways that you could go about doing this, and I specifically did not want to have to use a sewing machine and do a whole complicated pattern and sewing operation for this. So I went on Amazon and I bought some 4-inch seat pad foam, which comes wrapped tightly in plastic, and then I started cutting it up with this long knife. And basically what I'm going to be doing here is I'm going to be using spray adhesive, and I'm going to be gluing the foam down to the plywood, and then I'm going to be using a stapler to staple some fabric around the corners and essentially upholster the plywood and the foam in one shot. Now, this is a good trick to get an upholstered look without having a sewing machine and just having something simple like a tack stapler, and it does provide a really nice result. So I'm cutting up the foam, getting everything sized out correctly, and I'm trying to get a nice square to square edge on that inside corner. And this stuff is great. You can cut it really easily and cleanly with a sharp knife. And spray adhesive does work really well on it as long as you use something that is permanent. So once I get everything lined up and I know exactly where I'm going, I've got some Super 77 spray adhesive, and I'm coating the wood and the bottom of the foam, and then on both sides. And one of the big things with spray adhesive is you actually want to let both sides tack up a little bit. You don't want to immediately stick them together. You let that glue kind of tack up like you're using contact cement. And then once they've tacked up, you can position and press everything down. So I also did some spray adhesive between the two pieces of foam to try to kind of close up that seam, which you might notice when you're sitting on it, but probably not. It's a pretty small bench. So with that done, I flipped it over, let the weight of the plywood kind of help with that glue, and then I was able to trim off some of the excess here on the sides. And I could go ahead and get my fabric. Now, this is a outdoor fabric that my wife picked up from, I think, Joann Fabrics. I could put a link to it down in the description if anyone is interested. And it is a kind of a canvas, and we like the color a lot. We had some other cushions upholstered in it in the camper. And one of the things you don't really see, I don't think I filmed it, was I also clipped the corners off the plywood. You can sort of notice it in that front right corner there. I didn't want the corners of the wood to have an opportunity to rip the fabric. Now, upholstering this should have been pretty easy, but since it had an inside corner and I honestly wasn't really thinking about it, I had to kind of undo some steps and redo them. But you can see here I'm just folding the fabric over. I'm not really worrying about the corners right now. I'm just sort of getting around the edge, and then I'm using a T50 stapler. Now, here's where I made a mistake. I shouldn't have cut the fabric so prematurely because this inside corner is going to prove to be a little bit challenging. You need a lot of fabric to do an inside corner, and I was having this issue where it was, just kind of bubbling up and it really looked terrible. I was getting discouraged because I was out of fabric, and then I sort of had an idea of what I was going to do. So I loosely stapled around the two back sides of the corner, and didn't put a ton of tension on it. I wanted to use as little fabric as I could. And then I'm going to go and address that inside corner essentially with 2 pieces, almost like a patch. And if you've ever done any flashing, it's similar to how you would like flash the inside corner of a window. So essentially what I did was I figured out that if I use a piece of extra material and glue it into that corner, I could patch it and close it and then kind of do an artificial hem by rolling some fabric over onto itself and using spray glue for all this. You'll see when I flip down the panel what I decided to do here. I cut a little slit in the existing fabric and then I glued sort of this interior corner patch into that corner. You see how it's transitioning over both sides, and then I cut a V into the top fabric and I put down some masking so I wouldn't get spray glue on my fabric, which you definitely want to be careful of. And I put some spray glue on the top layer, and then I sort of rolled over the edge to make it look like a sewn hem. And then when I put this all together, I wound up with a very nice looking inside corner that has a piece of fabric underneath it, and it definitely keeps it looking really clean, and there's no gaps that you'd be able to ever see the foam. I thought this was a pretty elegant solution to a problem that I'm sure other people have come across, where you don't have a whole bunch of foam, a whole bunch of folds, and you don't really want to see a bunch of excess as you're, sitting on your couch. From this point, I could just go ahead and continue with the upholstery, and I was just basically folding over my corners and adding a lot of staples to make sure this thing is really solid. There was a pretty bad crease in the fabric itself, but that'll come out over time just with heat and people sitting on it. And I could just kind of run around with this little stapler. This is a battery-powered T50 stapler. It is like the best thing ever. If you do any stapling and if you've used the T50, you know how they can really just kind of wear your hand out, squeezing the trigger all day. This thing shoots staples so well and really makes it easy to use. I always keep it in my tool bag. So now with that done, I can put the cushion on. You can see how it looks really nice, and it's going to look great, especially when it's in the corner of the wall at the camper. Now I could pull this thing back off and I could just paint up the front. I'm using a paint and primer in one, the same stuff that we use to paint the cabinets in the camper. And this is from Home Depot. It's a Bear Premium something. I found that it definitely needs a couple of coats. You never get away with one coat, which all these paints claim that you do. And I just went ahead and added a bunch of paint to the front of this and made sure that I got the top as well so you wouldn't see anything if the cushion moved around. I gave it a coat, gave it some time to dry, and then came back and gave it a second coat. Now all the little staple holes, a lot of them are getting filled with the paint, but anything that doesn't, I'm going to caulk over and fill. And I might actually do some sort of trim, like batten strip sort of thing in the future. You want to make sure you get good coverage with paint like this, especially going over a brown MDF if you're not going to use a primer. Put the cushion on it, let it dry, and then we drove up to the camper to install it. Now it'll make a little more sense why I had to leave that corner open now, because you can see that there's a heater and you've got my water lines right over there as well. So I started by kind of wedging this thing in place, and I was really impressed with the fit. I did this whole thing off of measurements that I had taken a couple months earlier, but I did make a model in Google SketchUp, which is super helpful. Anytime you have to do a sort of build off-site for an on-site obstacle, it's really, really helpful. If you can learn how to use Google SketchUp, you can draw all the elements and then you can measure in your model as though you're on site. And it really, really helped me with this. I modeled out that little wooden box that was underneath where the heater is, so I knew exactly what I needed to do. And I also kind of factored in for where these vents are. Those are the heat output vents, and after I did a little bit of measuring and a little bit of cutting, I was able to get everything to fit in place, screwed into the wall. And then off camera, I painted that one vent white so it would blend in better. Once that was all done, you can see the cushion drops right in place and you can still get it out. It's not secured, you can just lift it out. My wife got some pillows for it and this thing is done. I'm super happy with how it came out. This replaced a pretty large sleeper sofa that was here that really took up a lot of room, and now it's going to be way more functional. You can still get underneath it, and if you need to, take the whole cushion off to get to the heater. We can store things down there in a nice secure spot, and you can sit on this comfortable foam couch, and it's really great. All right, that about does it for this video. Really easy project. I did use a track saw to break down the plywood, but you really don't need one of those. It's all 2x2 construction. And then I got this fabric from Joann Fabrics. It's like a outdoor grade cotton or something like that. The little trick I did on this inside corner, I'm not sure how well it's going to hold up, but it did accomplish the goal, and I think it's going to be fine. So a little bit of spray adhesive. You know, the thing with this was I could have taken this fabric to the sewing machine and made like, you know, a real sewn corner, but I wanted this to be like pretty DIY friendly. And just easier for me to make on my own. So 1/2-inch plywood on the top. Obviously my case was different than probably most other people's cases because I was trying to build it around that heater in the camper. And I did have to drill and cut a hole in the front for the heat vent. But you could easily do this in a regular corner, and honestly, it would be easier than the application that I just did it for. So again, really easy project and something that might get you into kind of building an upholstered piece of furniture like this and, you know, lead to some other cool stuff. So if you enjoyed this, please leave a comment and a like down below. Subscribe to my channel if you want to see more videos like this, more videos making stuff, and follow me right here at Make Everything Shop if you want to see what I'm doing on a day-to-day basis. I talked a little bit about this project on my Instagram stories, and overall, I think it came out great. Pillows look good with the fabric, and this is the same color as the rest of the cabinets in this camper. Now, if you're interested in this camper, I did a whole renovation of this thing, and there's another video which I'll link down below as well. And overall, I think this really ties it together and does a great job. So I hope you enjoyed this. My name is Chris Zepp from Make Everything, and I will see you on the next one.